Thank you, and hello everyone. Good afternoon. Hope you had a great lunch. Looking forward to this conversation. I was just telling Dan before we came up on stage, I've never had a chance to meet him, but I'm a big fan. He's saving me all kinds of money with his LinkedIn feed. I don't need to buy business books anymore. I just read what Dan posts. But he does have an awesome reading list in case people do want to or have a bigger book budget than I do. So Dan, do you want to do cap gains now or save it till the end?
Sure, let's dive right in.
You want to dive right into that? I was going to start slow, but if you want to go hard off the issue du jour, right off the top, let's set the stage on fire right away. So capital gains, you have a nuanced take on it, I've observed. So where do you sit now? We've had a couple of weeks to think it through. I know the initial reaction was hot. Where are you thinking now? Or what are you thinking about this issue now?
Yeah. So maybe I should just start with, and this is maybe a caveat, but I think it's important because I'm going to say some very critical things about our country today. I'm a big believer in Canada. I'm very optimistic about Canada's future. I just fundamentally believe we get the democracy that we earn, and that is a function of staring the hard parts of this in the face. And so Canada, let's talk about where we are in Canada. GDP per capita is flat in 10 years in this country. We have not improved the GDP per capita, so which means if a Canadian produced $100 10 years ago, they're producing $100 today. I think that the social order that we should care about is basically human rights and economic growth. And economic growth, I do believe heavily in the power of capitalism and the benefits of that. Now, just to ground this in and maybe make it concrete, because it's very difficult to understand slow GDP growth because it's just it's the boiling water, it's the frog in the boiling water, right? In America, they grew GDP about 4% on average between the year 1900 and 2000, right? If they would have grown that 3%, that marginal 1% of growth between 3% and 4% plus 100 years of compounding, today America would have the wealth of Mexico, right? And so that marginal 1%, the surpluses of that 1% went on to create space travel, vaccines, agriculture, technical innovation. It's certainly the reason that we are in this room today. You could argue that it helped them win World War II, right? And so GDP growth matters a lot, and we are at the bottom of the G20. Currently, we are at if you look at since 2020, we are the slowest growing out of the top 50 countries in the world. And the reason that I care a lot about GDP is because I have 2 young kids and I care deeply about the opportunities that they have in this country. And if we don't figure out how to grow this economy, they will have a very different set of opportunities. So rant aside, risk on, burn the bridges. The capital gains tax was interesting. I kind of stood in the middle on this one in the sense that we took the marginal cap gains rate from 50 to 66%. I don't think it's that intellectually honest that a bunch of people that were here and we're going to build companies here are now going to leave as a function of this tax rate change. I do think that it's powerful in that it's symbolic, in a drift between how we think the government and Canada should grow as an economy versus how the government does. And I will be critical of the fact that, and this chart has been making the rounds lately too, but government employment is up 40% in the since 2016. We've added 100,000 people to public service, right? We have 45,000 people employed in the Department of Labor, and entrepreneurship is down 100,000 people since the year 2000. What are these people doing? And when I think about that 100,000, I think that entrepreneurship is the best tool we have to both grow the economy and create social mobility for lower and middle income Canadians. And that's supported by angel investors and all you folks here. So, the capital gains tax I thought was much more symbolic. The interesting thing is that I think it mobilized a lot of tech community and raised, sorry, is there some feedback? And raised much more awareness around the issues of productivity. So I actually think it was a catalyst for productivity concerns, which are central to my belief as a Canadian.
Okay. Let's take a step back then and come back to KOHO's origin story.
Sure.
Why banking? Of all the paths you could choose to feed that entrepreneurial urge of yours, why would you choose that industry of all industries in this country?
Because I'm a dummy. My background was in wind energy, and I was fortunate to co-found a business in that space that started in small wind turbines. I've been to every town in southern Saskatchewan, putting out milk and cookies and asking 7-year-old farmers to buy wind turbines from me. They almost all said no. A few said yes. We got into industrial scale wind farm development and ended up selling that business, and I came into capital for the first time in my life. I grew up to a single mom in a very small town in BC. She drove buses, she cleaned houses, she worked very, very hard to give us a middle-class life in Canada, which was a wonderful thing. And then as I came into capital, I started asking the questions of like, what do people do with money? And they're very important decisions. Being in like a great financial set of products versus a bad one means retiring with 30 to 50% more wealth. It's a fact. And so the way that I looked at this was like, whatever a life of agency is to somebody, if you don't have financial stability, big chunks of that agency are going to be eroded, whether that means going back to school, putting kids through school, more time with family. And we have and so as I learned this, and then I looked at my mom's investment portfolio, who had worked very hard, she was one of these people. And I think the majority of Canadians are frankly these people who deserve a lot more financial stability than they have. And that is downstream of the most heavily centralized banking oligopoly in the world. And so that was the kind of origin of KOHO, was can we give everybody a great financial foundation? Can we democratize access to the best financial products? We started in 2015, we raised our capital, first bit of capital. We launched in 2017. Fast forward to today, we have 1.5 million Canadians on the product. We also power some wonderful companies like Wealthsimple. And we're very focused on, the paycheck to paycheck segment in this country, which is half of Canadians, 53% of Canadians.
How hard was it to raise money?
I mean, it's never easy. It's hard. It's really, really hard. But it's kind of supposed to be hard, You're trying to do something that statistically 98% of the time it's not going to reach real scale. So, when I'm up here and I criticize the Canadian government or the banking oligopoly, like part of your job as a founder is to make no excuses. The market is the market, and you have to find a way to be successful within the market. So, yeah, it's been hard, but we've also done it. So.
Right. So how did you do it? I mean, it's and this sort of leads into a point you made about how the entrepreneurship is declining in Canada for some reason. Yeah. So let's come at it that way. I mean, what do you think? Why aren't more people trying to do what you did, do you think?
Yeah, I ask myself that a lot. I do think that there's a cultural underpinnings to a lot of this. There's I think that part of what we lack in Canada is some equivalent of American exceptionalism. And there is a very clear cultural belief in America that you should be risk on, that you can be the best in the world, that you can win gold. And Toby, there was a wonderful event in Toronto last night with Toby from Shopify, and they talked about how Canada kind of has a go for bronze culture. And it's like, we celebrate our politeness. It's crazy, right? Like, we should beat our chests, we should be aggressive, we should try and win. And I think we can. We have an incredible economy, we have some of the smartest people in the world. Like 1/3 of the talent that works of the software talent that works at, big tech companies comes from the Toronto Waterloo region, right? We have all the raw materials in this country. And so, I don't have a great answer, but what I do think is I do think that it is a luxury to be able to start a business. If you are trying to pay rent, if you are living paycheck to paycheck, it's very hard to put aside 3 or 6 months of capital and to take on the risk profile, right? And so part of this is we have to make it easier for folks to start businesses, and upstream of that is economic prosperity in this country, and upstream of that is like GDP per capita growth.
As you look back now at your fundraising process, probably from I guess the beginning, are there things you see now that would have made that easier then?
Yeah, this might be more relevant for founders, but all of these, like, I think I was one of those folks who was too deferential, you know what I mean? And I think what matters, the way that we talk about this internally at KOHO is, and I think this is true of founders, it is better to be wrong and fast than it is to be right and slow. And so that takes a certain degree of like conviction about what you think you can do. And like a lot of founders, I still do, you know, you lack confidence in a lot of dimensions. And I wish that if I could go back, most of the mistakes that I made were functions of acquiescing more than like being too aggressive and doing dumb things, if that makes sense. And so, you know, if you think about and you folks are angels, you know that 8 out of 10 of your investments are going to go to 0 or 7 out of 10, right? So by definition, you're looking for outliers. And so if you go in there in a very Canadian way, in a very sort of judicious way, I think there's no reason that they should have belief that you're going to be an outlier, you know?
And so did you go in saying, I'm not going to be, or I'm going to be an outlier, or I'm going to, you know, make the power law work for you, or what was your approach?
I mean, I was fortunate that we'd already had some success. So like that, it was easier to underwrite me because we did, you know, had sold the company to a public company. But it is like when you, as you kind of think about the arc on an early stage or a seed bet, you're really underwriting the founder. It 100% is underwriting the founder. So people will underwrite to like a unique idea about the product or a unique skill set. They'll underwrite to people who are ultra-marathon runners. Like, what is the thing that says that you will work really hard and grind on this for the next 10 or 12 years, right? And so there's a breadth of things that folks will underwrite to. As you scale, obviously, you go from no data points on the business to millions of data points on the business. And then it becomes much more about performance. And I think that how we think about performance at KOHO is quite disciplined, but it's a very sort of more mechanics conversation at that point.
Was there an investor in particular that helped give you lift in the early stages, or anyone that stands out and really got you going?
I mean, they all have. I've had so just our first like real seed our Series A was done by Portage, which is now Sagard, and you know they said we'll give you $8 million for your Series A, but it means you got to move to Toronto. And I went back to my team and I said, and there, you know, we had maybe 6 weeks of pay left in the company. It was one of multiple near-death experiences. And I thought that the team was going to tell me to kick rocks. And, you know, I said, hey, we can keep running at this, but it means we got to move to Toronto. And of the 13 of us, I think 9 agreed in that meeting. And by that night, 11 folks had agreed to pick up their life and move across the country to Toronto. But Portage, and so that, you know, that is the risk-taking, and I'm forever grateful to those folks. Portage was very grateful in that they added a bunch of expertise in financial discipline. Our next investor was folks out of the US called Drive Capital, and our Series D investor was some more folks out of New York called Eldridge. You know, I remember my Drive Capital and Chris Olson, who's now the exec chair at KOHO, has been a wonderful partner, and he said to me, we were doing this partnership deal, and he said to me that, I think you're wrong, but if you are wrong, I will never say I told you so, you know? And I thought that was like exactly the right way to posture this. As a founder, I don't think you're a real founder until you realize that you could take investors' advice perfectly. And if that works or doesn't work, it's 100% on you. So like the founder mantle matters, you know?
Are there any other messages that you think an angel investing crowd needs to hear from a founder?
Yeah, I think the Canadian angel community, just in my own experience, like angel investing is power law driven, as you folks very well know. And my consistent experience with Canadian angels was like, when are you going to get to profitability? I was like, I don't even have a team yet. Like, what are we talking about? You know? And so I think that if you folks you're betting on the founder, and there is no business plan and there is no financials. Like I literally put, because our company's called KOHO, some of you know KOHO's a hockey stick. I put a KOHO hockey stick on a revenue chart because I was like, I have no idea what's going to happen, you know? But you're betting on the founder, and so I think the right thing to do is like push the founder to be ambitious, give them confidence, and support them. I think that's all you can do as an angel investor.
It's interesting to me that, you know, your first 3 main investors, 1 Canadian, 2 American. a few questions around that. I mean, what do you sense a different mentality between, I'll say Canadian money versus U.S. money? I mean, what are the differences in them?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think what you'd expect to be true is true. Our American investors are really aggressive in terms of what they want to do with the company. They are, it varies. They can be a little more sharp-elbowed, especially as you get later stage. And then our early stage folks are, look, they've been wonderful partners. They're much more rigorous and structured in how they think about this. Like, I think that there is a tendency to pretend that we can control a lot more than we do in these businesses, and that's true in Canadian venture investing, where we think that we can take all these risks off the table. And the fact is, it's just like, stuff breaks all the time, And so what I've found typically with the Canadian investors is they're looking for way more certainty, and we call it accuracy versus precision, but Canadian investors are looking for precision, which is like how many decimals on the zero, and accuracy is like directionally, are we going the right way?
As a founder, do you care where your money's coming from? Particularly a founder like you, I mean, you clearly care a lot about this country. I've watched you say amidst this capital gains debate that, you're not going to talk about fleeing the country. You're not even going to pretend you don't want to go. Would you prefer to be 100% backed by Canadian money? Does it ultimately matter to you? Like, just talk about that a bit, because there does seem to be, when we have these discussions, there is a bit of a nationalistic vibe, around this debate writ large, where there's sort of this lament that we don't have more Canadian investment money coming in. Let's look at the pension funds, and we're kind of mad at them right now for not investing enough in Canada. So I'm thinking about that, and I'm wondering, from your perspective, do you ultimately care, or do you think it matters where the money comes from?
Look, if KOHO works, I would obviously rather distribute that back into Canada. And we will do that with our employees, and we've done some of that with some secondaries. From an investment perspective, for sure, I would prefer Canadian capital, assuming that they had kind of an American attitude, But it's nice to have. It matters on the margin. It'd be great. I just, it hasn't been there. I think that the criticisms of the pensions is absolutely valid. So I think we've done a reasonably good job in early stage capital in this country. I think we've done a pretty poor job of late stage capital in this country.
Okay. Let's talk about policy in trying to build a company, and we can stick with yours. I would imagine when you were dreaming up KOHO and getting it off the ground, the prospect for policy looked far more helpful than it's become. And I'm thinking of open banking, real-time rail. These were infrastructural type things that should have helped the fintechs like yours, but we're still talking about them almost 10 years later. So, I mean, you can address some of these things if you want, but I'm just thinking, was the policy environment helpful for you in the early going, and what's that piece been like?
Sure, thank you. So when we actually started, there really wasn't. So the big difference between Canada and the United States in banking is that you have 8,000 banks in the United States. So you have this vertical, like you have this whole ecosystems of payment gateways and providers and payments, all the works. In Canada, we have 6 vertically integrated banks. And so the questions we were asking when we first started was, is this legal? And that was, we just didn't have the regulatory clarity. And then now, so just to folks, we've been talking about open banking, talking about open banking in this country for 10 years. It was originally studied the first time in, I think, the Senate in 2017. Okay, so we're talking about 7 or 8 years, and there's still not a single piece of paper which says this is how open banking will work in this country. And so forget all the wasted time that's attached to that. This should not be that hard, And there's a bunch of reasons which we can get into why it's hard in Canada, but this is a really simple issue, which is, are you the owner of your financial data as your bank? And everything else is clouding that. And I will call them out because I think it's a challenging organization. If you go look at the Canadian Bankers Association paper on open banking, which is the lobby group of our 6 banks in this country, they have an 11-page paper, and the first page says, we're supportive of open banking, and the next 10 pages say all the things that could go wrong with open banking. And it's like, of course this is the market that we got. We have regulators who can't fine, like the Consumer Protection Bureau and the Competition Bureau can't fine, right? We have a very powerful Canadian Banking Association lobby, and these banks employ hundreds of thousands of Canadians, and we celebrate their share returns, but it very often comes on the back of things that are harmful to everyday Canadians. Like that, there's a reason our banks are 50% more profitable than the US banks. And so, yeah, we have open banking and we have real-time rail, and, you know, like, I will be shocked if we ever see them. But I also, like, it'll be nice to have the hand-wringing around when's it coming. Like, I just don't care. It's my job to figure out how to make this work with or without open banking. I think that Canadians are clearly getting harmed by the lack of competition in this country, which real-time banking, or real-time rail and open banking support. But will it ever come? I don't know, and it's probably the only part of my life that I'm, like, pretty cynical about.
Right. The other big piece, I mean, like all kinds of things that the government's attempt to do to help innovation. The other big piece is SR&ED, the tax credit for research and development and the like. Has that been at all helpful for you, or was that at all helpful for you? I mean, the government spends a lot of money on this tax credit every year. It's supposed to be moving the needle, but
no.
Oh.
Look, I think they deploy $4 billion a year in SR&ED. Is that right?
Something like that, yeah.
I would say 80% of SR&ED companies are zombie companies that are there mostly to collect SR&ED grants. I'm going to get in trouble today.
Yeah, I'm writing that one down.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to tell people you said it. So, look, everything you need to know about SR&ED is that there's an entire industry of consultants around collecting SR&ED. Like, if you're going to deploy the capital to startups and make it easy. And yes, you will get some fraud and you will get some abuse and stuff like that, and I get that that's politically unpalatable. So is $4 billion, of which, like, I don't know, I think we maybe claimed $20,000 in SR&ED, you know? Like, and we're like, this is crazy. This is way too much work, because you have to justify all of your expenses, and you're either going to take on the risk of venture capital or you're not. And within startups, there's good and bad actors and good and bad companies. I don't think it is the market's job to pick winners. I think it's I don't think it's the government's job to pick winners. It's the market's job to pick winners. And so give the capital to people who can deploy capital, and everything else is just kind of get out of the way. All Same true of IRAP.
Okay, we've got 10 or so minutes. We're going to try to take some questions from the audience, I think, unless we just gave the only roving mic to Dan. But if anybody really wants to ask a question, put up your hand. Maybe we can find a way to figure it out. So in 10 minutes, let's solve the productivity problem. You care a lot about this issue. You've thought about it. I don't mean to put you on the spot. I don't say you should have solutions, but have you surrounded at least 2 or 3 themes or 2 or 3 pain points that might actually, turn this story around? I mean, the numbers, I'm sure everybody in this room is relatively aware, but I mean, Canadian productivity has basically been not just, it's been stagnant for a long, long time, but the troubling thing now is it's actually, productivity growth has been essentially negative for the better part of 2 years.
Yep.
So what do you think, Dan? Like, what are the, a few things that could be done to turn this around quickly? Because it does feel like it's a bit of an emergency. Like, we need to start taking this seriously.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it is. So Carolyn Rogers, who is runs the Bank of Canada, I think the Deputy Minister of the Bank of Canada, is a public official, and she said we have a productivity emergency. It is very, very rare for a public official, particularly in the Bank of Canada, to be so candid. So, look, I think a few things. I think that most of this is cultural. And I think where a lot of this actually starts is we need to celebrate capitalism a lot more as the vehicle for good that it is. And get a bit philosophical, but like people, I look at capitalism as like the best lever we have for long-term social good, and then NGOs and charities and many of these other things as the best lever we have for short-term social good. And the surpluses of long-term capitalism feed the short-term investments that we need to make around healthcare and social security and all the things that are very important in this country. Good schools, all that kind of stuff. And so, but I think we're like a bit masochistic in this country, culturally, around celebrating capitalism. And we do have some tall poppy syndrome, and I think that what we actually need to do is talk about this stuff all the way from our schools to our universities and have a cultural idea that like we should be really proud of the country that we have and the economy that we've built. Look, on a more tactical level, I think that we need to elect leaders who are not consensus builders, but have a strong and clear vision for the future. And if you try and make everybody happy, like we dealt with this, maybe I'll just give you a concrete example. We dealt with this where we were trying to build a $50 million wind farm in Saskatchewan, and the amount of hoops we had to jump through because an owl flies through it once every 3 years was crazy. You know? And it's like we're talking about $50 million worth of wind farm and green energy, and the same is true in mining. Like we can't mine the lithium in this country because like environmentalists are critical of it. The lithium that we mine in this country goes on to build the batteries that goes on to build electric vehicles, right? And so there's a lot of constituents in this country, and we need political leaders who are willing to piss some of them off. Like I think there's no version of the future that doesn't consider that. You know, I think that part of the reason that the capital gains tax was so frustrating to people was because the narrative of it was, we want the wealthy to pay their fair share. And I think broadly, the wealthy people that I interact with want good schools, want good places for their kids to go good hospitals. Nobody's trying to not pay taxes. I think the reason that it was frustrating was because we're looking at a government which has added 100,000 people in the last 8 years, and I don't really feel like anything's got better. 100,000 people, I know I'm in Ottawa, but 100,000 people is $10 billion a year in spend. And then we're talking about a $50 billion shortfall in the annual budget, and then saying the wealthy need to pay their fair share. So, you know, I think that we have to be honest about how effective or not effective our government is. And by the way, this is not like a liberal conservative thing. It's just the size of the government and the expenditures of the government, you know.
I'm going to ask you to respond to what I assume Chrystia Freeland or someone from the government would say if they were sitting here right now and just heard that. They'd say, I think, look, we identified, and of this politics aside, we all know that there's definitely a political element to everything they did in the budget, but to be fair, there's probably also a policy element, a group of people trying to do a right thing, and they have just choices to make, and they chose to go big on housing, bigger than they could afford because they've maxed out the credit card. So they had to raise revenue, and they chose the least bad option. I think that's what somebody from finance would say. How would you respond to that, Dan?
I think that it's the least, arguably, and I would make the case that it's not, but I would accept the claim that you're making the least bad option in the short term, and I would say it's the worst plan in the long term. And so I think that we are mortgaging tomorrow so that we can have a politically appealing strategy today. And I also just think it's disingenuous. Like there are, you know, this was framed as a tax that's going to impact the top 0.13% of Canadians. Okay, if you work for, it impacts the top 0.13% of tax events in a given year, which is a very different thing. So if you work for 14 years and then you sell your chain of 12 laundromats, you spike into this bracket for a year. But that doesn't make you the top 0.1% of wealthiest Canadians. It makes you that tax event which you have worked 14 or 15 years to accrue that value. And so I would say that it's a disingenuous framing, and I would say that it's intellectually dishonest.
Okay. There is a mic here. Anybody has any questions? I have more, of course, but I don't need to hog that opportunity. Just throw up your hand if you have. We've got another 5 or 10 minutes, and we'll fill them up. So the vibes are bad, but you don't make business decisions entirely on vibes. So how do you feel about the Canadian economy as it is? I mean, is this the kind of place that you think you can make some money? The kind of place that you think is just going to grow in spite of itself? Or just how do you feel about the medium term?
I feel good. I'm very critical, but I also think, like, as has been said, democracy is a contact sport. And I think you get the democracy that you earn. And so I think in a weird way, this capital gains tax has catalyzed a lot of people and made people much more aware of the productivity crisis that we have in this country. And like, economies slow down. And if you do the right things, they pick up. And I have a lot of faith in Canada and the people in Canada that we will figure this out. I think that's kind of the only posture that you can have. Like, it's, I think rational optimism is the only way to address this. It doesn't really matter what I believe. It matters that we got to fix the problem, and you can't throw your hands up and walk away.
So how would we fix the problem if you and I were sitting down in the finance ministry today and had our hands on the levers for a week or so? Like, what would be the first thing you'd do?
Yeah. So I think you want to reward risk-taking. I think America has a best-in-class process here. It's called the QSPS, where small business owners are, which I think employ 40% of this country. It's going down. But you want to make it as easy as possible to start a business and create the incentive structure to start a business. And so I would definitely lower taxes on small businesses, and I would certainly lower taxes, and I would certainly try and find something similar to a capital gains equivalent of the United States. I would also give the Consumer Protection Bureau, our Competition Bureau, I would probably actually double the size of them and make them much more, and give them the ability and the mandate to fine. We live in this middle road in Canada where I actually am not pro or anti-oligopoly as much as I am. You have to then adjust. If you're going to create an oligopoly, you have to protect those that are downstream of it. And our telcos are some of the most expensive in the world. Our Canadians pay the highest bank fees in the world. They pay $685 a year. If you have more than $5,000, you don't pay bank fees, which means the lion's share of that is borne by people who are lower income in this country. That's a 2% tax after their tax. Who's talking about that? We celebrate it because it's on a bank's P&L. And so I think I would what I would do is I would say open banking is live in 2 years, and we're going to fine you $1 million for every day that you're not live by the end of 2026. I would do the same thing with the real-time rail, and everybody who's not participating, you're going to get fined $1 million a day until you're not live, starting at the end of 2026. They'll figure it out,
It's going to be a good column coming up. Stay tuned. Thanks, man, for doing my work for me. Tell me this. Glancing at a McKinsey report on Fintech, apparently we have a question over here. I'll finish mine, and then we'll take the question from the audience. I was glancing at a McKinsey report on Fintech, which seemed to be suggesting that we're on the verge of a Fintech moment in Canada. I mean, feels like that might be true. I mean, you're having some success. You're on a path to becoming a Schedule I bank. Wealthsimple's doing well. We've been reading a lot about them lately. They've experienced all kinds of growth. Borrowell, there's some other really impressive stories out there. Sure. It gets back to one of my first questions, is why in the hell you'd want to choose the financial services industry in Canada. But how have you all done it? What do you think explains the fact that despite all the headwinds and we've been talking about, that the group of companies like yours have managed to stay in the fight?
So, I think if you ask Andrew or Mike or myself, we would say that it was always clear that this was an option in this country. And I totally understand why it wasn't clear when we first came out and wasn't clear to the average Canadian. But this is how, if you, Visa and Mastercard, as an example, when they launched, they had 25% fraud rates. And they were mailing pieces of paper around the country in 1970. This stuff is hard and it's messy. And Visa and Mastercard have gone on to build two of the best tools for globalization that we have ever had. It's incredible that you can go to Zimbabwe and buy something with the same card that you use at your local Tim Hortons, Charles Schwab got to $1 billion in assets under management. It took them 11 years. Today they manage 7.7 trillion, right? And that was in the last 25 years or something. So, I think that we as fintech founders just recognize that it takes a generation to build these businesses. And we're coming into the largest wealth transfer ever in the history of humanity is going to happen over the next 20 or 25 years. And so I think fintechs, the folks who are willing to put in the work early, feel like they're well positioned to participate in that. The Wealthsimple is growing their net assets under management faster than some of the big banks now. They've added $13 billion in AUM in the last 6 months. That's outpacing some of the big banks. Like this, it's happening with or without open banking.
Yeah, okay, that's a great story. There's a question back here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Kevin, Daniel, thanks so much. Juanita Lee with the Upside Foundation of Canada. You've talked a little bit, so you talked about, human rights as first priority, capital investment as second priority, and you've talked a lot about macro things, and then you actually have provided some really tangible kind of policy and actionable solutions. I'm curious, you just brought up Mastercard. Mastercard also invested part of their equity to build the Mastercard Foundation, which is arguably the largest foundation and most impactful foundation in North America with $36 billion worth of assets. And I'm curious about what you think this new Canadian social contract needs to be. We've talked about how we need to teach this in schools, and we need to really change the mindset and have more civically engaged Canadians for all the people who, don't vote. We're kind of in a room of a certain type of persona, and so I'm curious as to what you define that new social contract to be and how we actually deploy that outside of the 1% income earners or the 5% of the GDP that is Canada's tech sector.
So I just want to so are you asking what is this social contract that I as a founder owe Canadian constituents? Do I have that right?
Yeah, and what you hope that to be?
Yeah, it's probably true of how I think about, so my through line as I think about my career is just to be useful at scale. And I think that's probably true of how I think about what my social contract is. And so, I think KOHO can be a tool for real, I know it's a tool for real social good because we see it with our users every day. And I'm now, maybe this is not quite what you asked, but and I'm now at a place in my career where, I have some pretty strong conviction around some of these things, and I think that it's not always popular for me to say these things, and we're active in a bank application and stuff like that, and so I tend to think that I weighted this, but I kind of feel like I'm a citizen first and a CEO second, and my kids are growing up in this country, and so my social contract is to try and give them a great place to grow up, and that's really all I'm trying to do. Does that answer your question? A bit? Sorry, I can't hear you. Yeah. Yeah. So, so the question is, how does that wash through to basically social mobility, as I understand it, and a better standard of living for Canadians, right? And I think that is this social. I think that is what we're trying to do. So I believe that productivity and a productive economy is the thing that rides. A simple way to think about this, right, is any sane person would rather be a middle-income Canadian today than an ultra-wealthy person in the 1940s, right? And whether you want to talk education, access to information, mobility, whatever those things are, the standard of living improved 5 to 7x by most metrics between the year 1900 and the year 2000. That was driven by the greatest economy that's ever been created in the United States. That's my belief. It's not perfect. There are many valid criticisms of it, but I think that economic growth is the thing that creates the mobility so that as we create entrepreneurs, they can deploy that capital, or as we create into our local communities, right? And it's really, is it going to be a market-driven solution, or is it going to be a government-driven solution? And so this was kind of my criticism of this tax is the top 10% of Canadians pay 53% of the tax in this country. If it moves to 56, okay, fine. But the GDP is growing 0.5% a year. So the pie is shrinking effectively. So we cannot tax our way out of this, right? We have to grow our way out of this. And I think small businesses and entrepreneurship is the best lever we have. So I think that is the social contract.
Question over here.
Yeah, I was interested in your comment that you think fintech's on a roll in Canada, and that we have a lot of smaller fintechs, and as you said, it can take 20 years to build to scale. A colleague of mine was quite actively involved with Zafin Financial, which a month or two ago exited, or at least majority exited, to Nordic Capital, a private equity firm out of Sweden. And I don't actually have the number, but I know they were at an ARR of about 90 million US, so you got to believe it's a pretty big number. So I'm wondering, Kevin or Dan, if you have any comments on that, like how it impacts the fintech ecosystem, and the good, the bad of it, anything you make of this particular transaction, because it's kind of a defining one, I think, in Canada.
Do you want to go? I'm very happy for the folks at Zafin. I think it's okay. You know, like it kind of ties back into like the bronze culture, right? Which is, it's a good business. It's a great outcome. It's a great outcome for investors. We should ask ourselves why Zafin didn't go from 90 million to 900 million business. Like, I think that's a good question. You know, Wave, also a wonderful business, sold for 530 million to US Block. Canalist, also a wonderful business, sold for 400 million. We don't have a lot of companies that get to multi-billion-dollar outcomes, and I actually don't have a good answer as to why that is. You know. Sorry, I thought you had a question. But so yeah, look, I think it's great for those folks. I think we need more of them. I wish they would have held on longer. I wish they would have kept building. But every situation is different. Okay.